It is Tuesday, June 13th here in Draft Shark Studios in Rochester, New York. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Matt Schauf. With me, as always, is Jared Smola. The 2023 rankings have been live on DraftSharks.com since April. You probably already know that if you're watching or listening to us right now. They've been evolving since then. We've changed plenty on there already, Jared. They're going to continue to evolve because we're in our player profiles process right now. We're through the writing. They are being loaded to the site. And Jared, as part of that, we're all learning even more than we already knew about these players. We're digging into, stats and trends and facts that made last season go the way that it did, that we expect to affect this season. And that's bound to change the way that we think about a lot of these players, right?
Yeah, I've already changed my opinion on a few players, and I've only done 8 teams for these profiles. Now you've done 8, Kevin's done 8, Herms has done 8. So I'm excited to get with you guys after this process is done and kind of go through all these guys. And I'm sure we'll have some probably pretty significant changes to the rankings within the next couple weeks now.
Yeah, we already have a plan to get together, to argue about these, to talk about guys who should move up or down. So check the rankings now. They're live. They're going to stay live all the time. Check them now. Check them again next week and see who has moved. I think that'll be interesting to see who makes the biggest moves. One of the things I like about this is when I go in thinking, oh, this guy's got to move and I'm ready to fight for it. And then I say it and others are like, yeah, I agree. It's like, oh, well, what do we do now?
That's not fun.
Yeah. So as part of that, we have been talking about some of the tough to project units. Since we got the rankings up, we've gone through some backfields. We went through AFC pass catchers a couple weeks ago. Today, we're going to talk about the NFC pass catchers, and we're not going through every team, Jared. We're just talking about some of the teams that are really tougher to figure out. The guys that we don't have as much to go on for distributing the target share, or maybe there's just one new person, or maybe it's a new coaching staff. It could be a number of factors that makes it a little bit more of a guess and a little bit less of an educated guess than it is with some other teams.
Yeah, for sure. That's what we want to do here is really dig into these teams and figure out, for wide receivers, especially, where these targets are going to go, because that's what fuels fantasy points, and, figuring that out is a big key to getting this stuff right.
If you missed any of those previous shows, like I said, 2 backfield shows, another pass catcher show, you can check them out on our YouTube channel or anywhere you get your podcasts. While you're there, do us a favor, subscribe, rate, review. We appreciate it. It helps us out, helps us do our thing here. So we're going to dig in right now to the first team. We're going to start with the Arizona Cardinals. And Jared, the big change for them since the projections went live is DeAndre Hopkins finally got released. It wasn't a shock. There was talk about him moving on. There was trade talk previously. Obviously, that trade never materialized, probably because he was too expensive for what any team would have to give to acquire him and then pay him. But it leaves behind a lot of unknowns in Arizona. The biggest name is Marquise Brown, and he produced last year when DeAndre Hopkins was not on the field because of his early season suspension. Top 8 fantasy wide receiver across the first 6 games while Hopkins was suspended. Wide receiver 18 target share over that span. That dropped quite a bit after Hopkins came back. There was a broken foot, but even in just the games where Marquise Brown was actually able to play, wide receiver 39 target share with DeAndre Hopkins around. What do you see for the Cardinals pass catchers going forward?
Yeah, I mean, this Hopkins departure is massive. He averaged 10.7 targets per game last year. And if you just look over his 3 seasons in Arizona, 9.1 targets per game. On top of Hopkins' departure, we have a new coaching staff in Arizona. Cliff Kingsbury out. It's Jonathan Gannon as head coach. He's a defensive guy, and then Drew Petzing as the OC. We have no history of his play calling, so he's a total wild card. And then we have the quarterback situation with Kyler Murray probably not ready for the start of the season, kind of unclear when he is going to be ready. So just a ton of moving parts here. But again, tons of opportunity up for grabs with DeAndre Hopkins gone. And like you said, Marquise Brown did take advantage of that. 9.6 targets per game for Brown in his 8 healthy games without DeAndre Hopkins. If he can come anywhere close to that level of volume, he's gonna turn out to be a pretty nice value for where he's been going in fantasy drafts. We'll see. I think the ADP is probably still adjusting on Marquise Brown, but as long as he doesn't climb into the top, 25 wide receivers, I think he's a pretty nice target based on volume upside alone.
Yeah, he's not quite going at a range now where I'm like, oh, I got to get Marquise Brown now before he skyrockets, but he's certainly going in a range where he is fine to grab shares of. And the biggest unknown here is the Kyler Murray situation. And I think the thing that makes the Cardinals so interesting, if So Kyler Murray is basically being treated by the market like he's a zero for the season. He's way down the quarterback rankings, and you can tell that just there's no talk about the Cardinals because everybody's assuming no Kyler Murray, and if it's Colt McCoy or Clayton Tune, then nobody's really buying into the Cardinals. That's what makes the situation more interesting. If Kyler Murray was QB 14, QB 12, and everybody else was with him, on the value front that way, this would just be a team to pass on, not pay any attention to. But I think the fact that you can get Kyler Murray very late in drafts makes him more interesting, but also makes stacking his pass catchers with him that much more interesting.
Yeah, I'm kind of operating under the assumption that we're gonna, miss Murray for the first quarter to first half of the season, somewhere in that range, and that's sort of what our projections are assuming at this point. Obviously, if he starts to look like he's going to be back sooner, these Cardinals wide receivers are going to climb our rankings. If we get bad news on Murray, they might drop a little bit. I do think Colt McCoy is serviceable. Like, he's not great, but I think he can keep the offense afloat. The other interesting thing about the Cardinals, and potentially good news for the volume for all these guys, their Vegas win total is 4.5 wins. That's the lowest in the NFL. So, the bookmakers expect this to be a really bad team. That's not necessarily good news for the fantasy prospects of these guys, because we do want guys on good offenses, obviously. But if they are playing from behind a lot, there's a chance they throw even more this season than they did last.
Yeah, the bookmakers think they're going to stink. The pod makers think they're going to stink as well. So it certainly factors in to the passing volume upside. Beyond Marquise Brown, Rondale Moore's still there. Are we betting on the talent with him? Greg Dortch returns. Is he the main slot guy? Or is rookie Michael Wilson the wide receiver 3 on the outside? Those are the kind of questions that we're going to have to wait and answer throughout the summer, and then help us figure out how to spread things around here and what to expect from people.
Yeah, Rondale Moore is still interesting to me. And obviously he's had trouble staying healthy, even going back to his college days. But we got 7 healthy games from him last year. He averaged 8 targets per game on a 23% target share in those games. Now, none of those games came with both Marquise Brown and DeAndre Hopkins. I think Brown missed the first 3 and Hopkins missed the final 4. Maybe it was vice versa. But again, he's not going to be dealing with DeAndre Hopkins this season. So I do think, a target share around like 20% is possible for him. I'm curious to see if Moore plays in 2 wide receiver sets, right? Because he is small. He has been used mostly in the slot. So is it going to be Rondale Moore opposite Marquise Brown in 2 wide sets? Or I think Michael Wilson has a chance to be that guy too, because he's the only one of these Cardinals wide receivers that has any modicum of size at all. Michael Wilson is 6'2", 213 pounds. So he has the body type to be that prototypical outside wide receiver. So Wilson wasn't a rookie I was super excited about. But I do think, after the Hopkins release, there's a chance that, Wilson is basically a full-time player for the Cardinals this season. And that alone would make him, someone worth, maybe taking shots on in the very last round of your best ball drafts.
And certainly nobody behind Marquise Brown has enough established in the NFL to say, yeah, this guy is definitely the one to bet on. Rondale Moore, you'd like to think he's the second best wide receiver there. He was an early second-round pick just a couple of years ago, has played some on the outside, looks like a slot guy, but ultimately I would think coaches would pick their best 2 receivers as opposed to saying we need somebody who's tall, even though that other guy is better. So we'll see how that sorts out. It's going to be something to watch through the summer. Certainly something that's going to be updated in Shark Bites as we get practices to evaluate. The tight ends are also interesting here. And there's also an ACL question on that front. Zach Ertz is coming off an ACL tear, so we have to see if he's going to be ready for the season, and whether he is likely to have a big impact on whether Trey McBride is a worthwhile fantasy contributor in his second season. I kind of hope that we either don't get Zach Ertz to open the season, or like he gets traded to some team that has a tight end need and can afford to give a frivolous draft pick for somebody that might help them, because Trey McBride profiles well if he gets the opportunity. He was dating back to high school. He was a multi-sport star. He was a high volume receiver over his final 2 years at Colorado State. He won the John Mackey Award his final year in college, top tight end in FBS. So he has enough talent to be a factor, and certainly a tight end like that can be a key target for whomever the quarterback is, whether it's Kyler Murray, who has obviously more explosiveness to him, or it's somebody more limited like Colt McCoy or Clayton Tune, which we're not going to talk about a lot here. But, the tight end could be a factor for whomever's throwing passes here.
For sure. Yeah. Starting with McBride, he was definitely an intriguing prospect coming out. And I would never write off a tight end after his rookie season, because we know tight ends generally struggle as rookies. But man, there is nothing from McBride's rookie season to be encouraged by. He barely hit the stat sheet while Zach Ertz was healthy last season. McBride had 3 catches over the first 9 weeks of the season when Ertz was healthy. Over the final 7 games for McBride, 25 catches, 234 yards, and 1 touchdown. He was, tight end 9 or tight end 19 in PPR points during that stretch. Still saw just a 12% target share though, and fared really poorly in terms of PFF receiving grade. He was 26th among 27 qualifying tight ends, 24th among those 27 in yards per route run. So he's going to need to take a big step forward to be someone that we're excited about in fantasy, which again is possible because we see tight ends take step forwards in their second year. I guess Mark, in McBride's favor, I had sort of forgotten how productive Zach Ertz was before that injury. He was sitting third among tight ends in PPR points through week 9 last season before he went down with that knee injury. He saw 19.5% of Cardinals targets. Now, again, he's coming off that torn ACL suffered in week 10. That has him iffy for the start of the season. He turns 33 in November. So, despite how productive he was last year, I'm really not excited about Zach Ertz at all. But I do think the fact that he was able to, garner that type of target share and be that productive is, encouraging for Trey McBride if, again, he can, make improvements in his second year.
Yeah, and I'm basically throwing out McBride's rookie year. I mean, he was a rookie tight end who usually stink. It was a deteriorating offense under a bad coach who is gone. And it was awful quarterback play by the time he got on the field. So I'm not judging anything from last year. I see a guy who was a second-round pick a year ago, was a very productive receiver in college. Not excited about him, but somebody I'm interested in going forward. Our second team that we're talking about here is the Carolina Panthers. And, we're talking about unexciting pass catchers. This is a hub for them this season. They brought in Adam Thielen. They brought in DJ Chark. They drafted Jonathan Mingo in round 2. Terrace Marshall is actually their leading returning receiver from last year. He caught 28 passes. So there's not a whole lot to love. They also brought in a tight end we'll talk about a little bit later. What do you think about these Panthers receivers first, though?
Yeah, to me, the biggest reason it's unexciting right now is because we just have no idea what this wide receiver core is going to look like. I do think, you have this, rookie quarterback that we really like in Bryce Young, who I think is capable of, being a quality NFL guy, quarterback right out of the gate. We have a new head coach in Frank Reich, who I like as an offensive mind. Like, I think he could help this Panthers offense take a nice step forward, but figuring out what this wide receiver situation is going to look like is really tough. We have Adam Thielen, who got a 3-year, $25 million deal. That's like the biggest mark in favor of Thielen, because you look at his production last year, you look at some of the underlying metrics, and they weren't good. He's getting up there in age, so I do wonder about Thielen. But the Panthers obviously still believe in him to some extent, and I think that contract means he's going to play a pretty big role, at least to start the season. DJ Chark also arrives on a 1-year deal. He got $5 million. Then they draft Jonathan Mingo with the 39th overall pick. So lots of new faces here. And again, the fact that it is a brand new coaching staff, to me, sort of makes this wide open.
Yeah. And Jared, I'm going to look now to DS University and our primary draft pillar, the very first thing. If you look at our redraft rules, the first pillar, pursue value above all else. And that's the only thing that makes these guys in Carolina interesting. If we were talking about Adam Thielen as an athlete at this point, he's a declining receiver. He's going to be 33 when the season starts. You can look at his numbers from the past 2 seasons in Minnesota, and he's clearly on the decline. But as you said, the Panthers gave him a bunch of money, and the GM said he's going to go a long way to replacing what we lost in trading away DJ Moore. Now, I don't think he's going to do so physically, but in terms of getting the target share that was going to DJ Moore, I think that's where Adam Thielen's going to fill in. If he was wide receiver 30 in ADP, I'd be like, we're going to pass on him because there's not a whole lot of upside from there. But he's going well into the 40s and even going behind Jonathan Mingo at this point in best ball drafts. So from that standpoint, I'm in on Adam Thielen.
Yeah, I think he's a prime case of where you need to weigh like floor projections versus ceiling projections, which you can find on Draft Sharks. Because if you're interested in floor, which in some cases you should be, right? If you're just a 10 or 12 team contained fantasy league and you're setting lineups and you're going to have playoffs and all that, and you're not super worried about ceiling, I think Thielen makes sense. Now, if you're in one of these massive best ball tournaments like Underdog, where you're trying to win, $2 million or whatever it is against 500,000 other teams, and you care about ceiling, there's probably other guys in Thielen's ADP range that I'm more excited about.
Do you have anybody in mind? Because I think
no.
I'm gonna give you a second to maybe check the ADP, but we're primarily in best ball season right now, and I'm still taking plenty of Adam Thielen. Not like I gotta put Adam Thielen on my roster because the upside is huge, but the range where he is going, very low in wide receiver 4 and even into wide receiver 5 range. I'll take him as a wide receiver 6, depending on how I'm building that roster. But he doesn't have the explosive upside, but he absolutely has the upside to give you 6 catches for 60 yards and a touchdown at any point. And I mean, that's not a week winning number, but when we're just looking to put together a full lineup of producers every week, that's a guy who's going to make it into your lineup quite a bit, especially if we get into full PPR tournaments like on FFPC and Drafters.
Yeah, I pulled up Underdog's ADP, and Thielen is wide receiver 64. I think that's like 15 spots lower than we have him ranked. So even here, I can't argue against him. I do think like guys going within 10 picks, like Michael Gallup, I think has a higher ceiling, and I'd take him. You're going to hate this one. I'd probably, in a best ball tournament, I'd even take Jonathan Mingo ahead of Adam Thielen, because especially in the second half of the season, I think Mingo has a chance to be the higher upside fantasy player.
I would hate it if you told me I had to do it. I love it if you're going to do it, because it just means I can wait and take Adam Thielen as the wide receiver 64. Jonathan Mingo was a slow build in college. I know that he's very athletic and he finished it with an exciting ceiling, but I don't have any reason to believe right now that he's going to be an immediate NFL producer. So I'm out on Jonathan Mingo as the first Panthers wide receiver in ADP. I'm out on DJ Chark because I just don't believe in him enough as a player to target him wherever he's going. I don't care about him. The Panther that I'm most in on, it gets back to that value, is Hayden Hurst, because he's going beyond tight end 2 territory. He's going as a tight end 3, even though the Panthers signed him for $21 million. They're paying him $7 million a year over 3 years. He does not have to be a good NFL player to pay off at that level. He was a Bengal last year with much better wide receivers around him than are in Carolina. And Hayden Hurst finished 18th in target share among tight ends on that team. If he does that with this team, that alone is going to make him a value who's going to show up in my best ball lineups, who is okay as a stash even in lineup setting leagues as a tight end 2, because there's room for Hayden Hurst to be a 22% target share guy on this particular Panthers team. And if he does that, he's got tight end 12, tight end 10, maybe tight end 8 upside ultimately in PPR, just because of how little the Panthers have going for them this year.
Yeah, I really don't want to turn into the Hayden Hurst site.
I'll do it.
He's so unexciting, but he's 17th in our tight end rankings, and he's tight end 26 in Underdog ADP. So I do think he is a massive value. The other thing working in Hurst's favor, on top of the contract that you talked about, Frank Reich has a pretty nice history of utilizing his tight ends at an above league average rate. Now that wasn't the case the last 2 years. But if you look at Reich's first 7 years as an NFL head coach or offensive coordinator, his team's tight ends saw an above average target share in all 7 of those seasons. And yeah, that could certainly be the case this year in Carolina with, how many question marks there are at wide receiver.
Now, to be fair, he did have Antonio Gates, Dallas Goedert, Zach Ertz in that span. Nobody here is going to say that Hayden Hurst is in that class, but looking at what's around him, what we've already talked about, opportunity is obviously there.
For sure.
So let's move to team 3, and we've got the Green Bay Packers up. And I think this one is way more interesting than the 2 teams we've talked about so far. And Jared, I'm going to let you start out with the Packers pass catchers, because I know that you are higher on Christian Watson than I am.
Yeah, I mean, Christian Watson had an awesome rookie season. And it's not the touchdowns he scored, because, 17.1% touchdown rate, that's obviously going to regress. Like that could be sliced in half. It's more the underlying stuff that has me really excited about Christian Watson. 2.26 yards per route run last year. That was 11th best league-wide among 80 wide receivers with 50-plus targets. It was also second best among last year's rookies, behind Chris Olave, but ahead of Drake London and Garrett Wilson. Watson's yards per route run last year was the 8th best mark from any rookie wide receiver over the last 11 years. Then he also gave us a pretty nice target earning profile. So he played 80% of Green Bay snaps or more in 6 games last season, 22.7% target share in those 6 games, a really nice mark from a rookie. And then if you look at targets per route run, Christian Watson, 24.4% last year. That trailed Drake London and Chris Olave, but was above Garrett Wilson, who was at 24.0%, also higher than Treylon Burks, Jahan Dotson. So just the profile that Watson gave us last year, obviously in a small sample, obviously with Aaron Rodgers. So those are the issues, and those are probably the concerns you have heading into this year. But just what we saw from him last year. And then going back to his pre-draft profile, a guy who obviously had upside coming into the league, right? Like we were all worried about the floor on Watson, but just what he showed last year has me pretty excited about for him heading into 2023.
I am wary of jumping from being low on a player one year to being high on him the following year because of a span of success. Even if we look at the best span for Christian Watson last year, he ranked 30th among wide receivers in target share from week 10 on last year. His best stretch in that span for fantasy points was week 10 to week 13. He ranked wide receiver 32 in target share over that span. You already mentioned the quarterback. I mean, the efficiency is going to go down. He just finished playing with one of the best quarterbacks ever. I know that we didn't get peak Aaron Rodgers last year, but I'm going to go ahead and assume that even last year's version of Aaron Rodgers is better, efficiency-wise at least, than Jordan Love. So I'm going to assume some efficiency dip from Christian Watson. So we need a significant rise in target share. And that is the other issue that I think is introduced here. So ADP has Christian Watson inside of wide receiver 2 range, right about wide receiver 20, depending on exactly where you're drafting. Mid-round 4 on drafters, which is full PPR. Look at his teammates. Romeo Doubs, early round 12. That's 8 rounds behind Christian Watson. Jaden Reed, round 13, 14 turns. So I agree that Christian Watson is likely to be the top Packers receiver. Is he a dominant number 1 for them? Because that's what that gap in ADP says, that Christian Watson is the dominant lead receiver for the Packers, and these other guys are just supporting players. I don't think that there's really a good reason to believe that that's the case. I think what we were concerned about with Watson coming in is that he didn't look like the dominant number 1 target earner. He was a big play guy who definitely can produce on less volume than some other players. And I think that's what he showed us last year. And now we're like, oh, well, I'm not worried about those things because I've seen him do it in the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, so the reason I'm not pounding the table too hard for Watson is because of his ADP. You know, he's wide receiver 21 in ADP on Underdog. That's exactly where we have him ranked. So I don't think he's just, massive value. I think people are kind of seeing what I'm seeing from Watson last year. But again, just looking at what he did as a rookie, and especially comparing it to Romeo Doubs, I do think Watson has a chance to be like the clear, number 1 wide receiver. Maybe not quite, target hog levels, but I think 23 to 25% target share is definitely within his range of outcomes. I'm not sure it is for someone like Doubs.
And 23 to 25 would be okay, would give him a shot to pay off at his price. He would have to have strong efficiency to boost upside beyond that level, though. And just to add some context here, if you do take Christian Watson around ADP, and for what it's worth, if you're drafting on Underdog, fine, mix in some Christian Watson, because playing in a best ball tournament with playoff weeks, that's absolutely the optimal format for him. He could have a disappointing season overall and still win you the tournament if he's big in week 17. So we'll get that out of the way. But overall, and then as we go toward lineup setting leagues, I think he's going to be far less attractive. And by the way, check the Draft Sharks rankings next week to see if he stays where he is in those current rankings. He is right behind Jerry Jeudy right now in ADP, a few spots behind Amari Cooper, less than a half a round of picks behind Amari Cooper. So to take Christian Watson, you basically have to take him over Jerry Jeudy and Amari Cooper, or hope that he slides past ADP. He's ahead of Christian Kirk, Drake London, Terry McLaurin, Travis Etienne to go to running back, Mike Williams, DJ Moore, Chris Godwin. Marquise Brown is a round and a half behind Christian Watson. Deontay Johnson's behind that. Tyler Lockett's still on the board. Treylon Burks is 2.5 rounds after Christian Watson. And I think he is an interesting inflection point, an interesting comparison player, because to me, the big difference between Treylon Burks and Christian Watson is that we saw Christian Watson stay relatively healthy and produce last year. We did not see that from Treylon Burks last year. But if we rewind a year, Treylon Burks was the first round pick that we all believed had big upside. Christian Watson was the second rounder that we were all wary of. So now the biggest difference is having seen it with one, not having seen it with the other. I still think Treylon Burks is the higher ceiling player. And if I can get him 2.5 rounds later, that's only further incentive for me to pass on Christian Watson and get a very similar player later in the draft, who I like individually straight up.
Yeah, it's a tricky part, right? How to weigh, what we saw in one NFL season versus, these prospect profiles coming in to the NFL. But I mean, undoubtedly, Watson had a better rookie season than Treylon Burks. So I definitely think that matters. And I do think they're similar in the offenses that are going to be run leaning, but both guys have a chance to be the clear target leader on their team. So yeah, I'm with you. Burks is a better value. I'm not arguing that. I do think Watson deserves to be going a bit higher in drafts. But again, I think Watson's fairly priced. Like among the guys you mentioned, Tyler Lockett, I'm taking over Christian Watson, but that's not even really a comparison because they're going like 2 rounds apart. I do think Mike Williams deserves to be above Christian Watson, but otherwise, I think Watson is kind of priced, at least among wide receivers, where he should be.
I disagree, but we'll get into more of that as we talk through the rankings. So you can check those rankings now before we change anything, see exactly where Christian Watson is, see where the other Packers are right now, see if anything changes next week. Check it now, check it later, see if I get my way when we talk to the other guys and bring them into this conversation. Elsewhere among Packers, like I don't think there's a whole lot of arguing to do on Romeo Doubs and Jaden Reed because they're going late enough that if you want to pass on them, fine. If you want to take shots on them, fine. And we'll kind of see through the summer exactly what their roles are going to look like.
Yeah, Doubs, by the way, also like Watson, had 6 games last year with an 80+% snap rate, basically full playing time. 18.7% target share for Doubs in those 6 games, which is kind of like, wide receiver 2 level, number 2 NFL receiver level production, not wide receiver 2 fantasy level.
That's not that far, by the way, from the 22% for Watson.
22.7 for Watson. So, 4 percentage points apart, which is significant, not huge, but
over 6 games. I don't know. That's pretty similar range.
Yeah. And Watson obviously also crushed Doubs in yards per route run. And then, Jaden Reed, it looks like he's, has a clear path to the starting slot job in Green Bay, already running with the first team and, OTAs and minicamp. And I was digging into the Packers too, and the Jaden Reed pick probably shouldn't have been surprising because the Packers lost their top 3 players in slot snaps last season. Randall Cobb, Alan Lazard, Robert Tonyan. Those were 1, 2, 3 in slot snaps for the Packers last year. So they obviously had a hole to fill, and I think they see Jaden Reed filling that hole right away.
Yeah, I think he's going to have a hard time giving us much value in redraft. I certainly like Jaden Reed, as I've talked about plenty for Dynasty. The tight ends, no thanks for me on a team that's relying on 2 rookie tight ends and a brand new quarterback. I just want none of them.
Yep, agreed.
And then I guess we could talk about Aaron Jones as part of this. He's not, we're talking basically receivers and tight ends. Aaron Jones, more of a receiver than most running backs. Yep. I'm a little bit wary with the Jordan Love factor heading into this season, both from the receiving standpoint and from his touchdown upside.
Me too. And I don't know exactly how much to weigh this, but from the first half to the second half of the season, we saw that the split in both playing time and usage shrink between Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon. Actually, over the second half of the season, Aaron Jones averaged 3.8 targets per game. That was down 1 target from the first half of the season. And A.J. Dillon was at 2.4 targets per game. So the gap, wasn't that big, even as far as receiving, passing game usage goes. So Jones isn't someone I'm, aggressively targeting. I think he's fine at cost, but he's not a big target for me in drafts right now.
I'm not chasing either of the running backs, but between them, I'd rather have A.J. Dillon because he's going at a much lower risk range in best ball drafts. New Orleans Saints are the next team up here. And obviously Chris Olave is where you have to start with this group. A very impressive rookie season, wide receiver 13 now in PPR ADP coming off of that season. And Jared, that's something that you have to factor in as you talk about him because, everybody likes Chris Olave coming off of last season. So the question is he worth what you have to pay to get him on a redraft roster for 2023?
Yeah, Olave was 27th in PPR points per game last year. So, if you're taking him a wide receiver 13, you're expecting a big jump in fantasy production. Now, the easy way for him to jump is just scoring more touchdowns. He only scored 4 touchdowns and 72 catches last year. That's a 5.6% touchdown rate, basically 2 percentage points below the league average for wide receivers. So there should be some positive regression coming for Olave in the touchdown department. Everything else from his rookie season was truly, truly elite as far as rookie production goes. 28.5% target share in his 13 healthy games, 2.42 yards per route run, even better than Christian Watson last year. Olave's yards per route run last year, the 5th best mark among qualifying rookie wide receivers of the last 10 seasons. The 4 guys ahead of Olave on that list, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown, Odell Beckham. So like I'm all in on Olave being an awesome receiver. It's just, is this Saints offense going to support him as, a top 12, top 13 type fantasy producer?
Yeah, and he's wide receiver 12 on Underdog. Again, if you're drafting a bunch of teams into best ball tournaments with playoff weeks, you should mix in some Olave because he's going to be a big game guy, even if over the course of a season he lets you down along the lines of Christian Watson. But he was wide receiver 21 in target share last year, and that was with Michael Thomas missing nearly all of the season. It was with a very limited Jarvis Landry and with not much else behind those guys. The target share for Chris Olave did not grow after Michael Thomas went down. So he was in that low wide receiver 2 range in target share. Now, he's the style of player that's going to deliver above average results. He should be strong on efficiency because of the yardage. And especially with the quarterback upgrade, which we should be getting in Derek Carr. They threw a bunch of money at him. Clearly, they think it's a big upgrade over Andy Dalton, Jameis Winston, and I would agree with that. But I don't like Olave where he's going, which is inside of round 2 for best ball drafts. Probably going to be in a similar range as we get to lineup setting. That might be sometime in round 3 as opposed to late in round 2 where wide receivers are getting pushed up. But if Chris Olave is going right around that fringe of wide receiver 1 territory for setting my lineup, that's going to be somebody I'm not drafting very often.
Yeah, he's tough. I mean, he even comes out lower in our projections, our rankings than ADP. So I'm definitely not like getting a ton of Chris Olave. He's also a guy I don't want to be totally out on just because how impressive his rookie season was. Not to spend too much time on the quarterbacks, but I agree that Derek Carr is better than Andy Dalton if you look at the span of their careers. I don't know how much better Carr is going to be than how Dalton played for the Saints last year. He had a 67% completion rate, 7.6 yards per attempt, a 4.8% touchdown rate. That's a bit above league average. So I'm not banking on the Saints getting like much better quarterback play this season than they got last year.
There were quite large swings in how Andy Dalton performed, though. We would get a few enormous games and some other true Andy Dalton ones. And we're coming off the worst season of Derek Carr's career. So it's a little bit tough to judge. I think just generally treating it as a QB upgrade. I'm not like boosting any Saints on that. And that's, part of why I'm not chasing Chris Olave at his elevated price. But as long as we treat it as a slight upgrade, I think that's fair. We talk about Chris Olave first because I don't think that the teammates are as big a factor on him for 2023 as just the expectations versus where he's going. Michael Thomas made it back for the start of last season, then quickly went down again with another lower body injury. It doesn't seem like it was related. It was a separate injury from the ankle that knocked him out for most of the previous 2 seasons. But nevertheless, another lower body thing. He also had a hamstring injury last summer that limited his practice time. So you have to factor that in with him going forward. You should bet on at least a solid target share for Michael Thomas whenever he's on the field. It probably doesn't have that monster target upside, though, that he did several years ago. It's probably Chris Olave leading the team in that category going forward. So that changes the evaluation on Michael Thomas. I don't think the ceiling is anywhere near what it used to be. I do think it's higher than his wide receiver 47 ADP in general right now.
Yeah, but who knows what to make of Michael Thomas? He's played 10 games over the last 3 seasons, and he turned 30 back in March too. So that's starting to become a concern. Now he was pretty productive in his 3 games last season: 57 yards and 2 touchdowns in week 1, 65 yards and a score in week 2, 5 catches for 49 yards in week 3. That's all we got from him last year. He saw a 19% target share in those 3 games. I think that's a pretty realistic level to expect from Thomas, because I do think even in those first 3 games, Chris Olave out-targeted Michael Thomas 29-22. And those were the first 3 games of Chris Olave's career. So I do think Olave is the clear one. If you can get 20% target share from Thomas, somewhere in that range, I do think he's okay at wide receiver 47.
Right. I agree. What's the ceiling? Wide receiver 30, maybe like wide receiver 26, certainly not higher than that, I would say. So it's somebody who's totally fine to be out on. If you want to get some Michael Thomas at wide receiver 47, I think that's fine as well. What are you doing with Michael Thomas, though? Let us know in the comments on YouTube right now. Are you just buying in because you believe he's going to get back to pre-injury form? I think you're crazy if that's the case. But, if that's what you believe, let us know. Are you totally out? We want to hear that too. And if you want to talk about any of the upcoming Saints pass catchers, Rashid Shaheed is next on the list of guys here. Jared, I like the speed. I think he's an intriguing player. I don't think that the situation is good enough, either in terms of volume upside or quarterback efficiency, to really make Shaheed that interesting for 2023 fantasy leagues.
Yeah, we should give Shaheed a shout out for averaging 14.4 yards per target last year. That was the single best mark among any wide receiver with 30 plus targets over the last 10 years. And that's obviously going to take a massive, massive hit this season. I mean, ultimately, he's a 180-pound former undrafted free agent. Like, I just don't think he's a good bet. Maybe if Michael Thomas misses a bunch of time again, Shaheed could be useful. Even then, it's probably only in best ball. I can't imagine him ever being someone we're comfortable starting in a lineup setting league. But he's just there's other receivers I'd rather take shots on late in fantasy drafts.
Agreed. You can stash him in Dynasty. That's fine. I don't see the path to real worth in 2023. The tight ends would be more interesting if either of them was not on this team too, or if this was a team that we could project for top 10 passing volume, at least as far as I'm concerned. The Saints, by the way, 25th, 30th, and 26th in pass rate the past 3 years. Now, probably a little bit higher than that this year after paying Derek Carr and paying Juwan Johnson and paying Foster Moreau, but they also paid Jamal Williams. They also drafted Kendre Miller in round 3. So I don't think this is a team that's going to shift to a ton of passing. So, Jared, Juwan Johnson, Foster Moreau, I'm not super interested in either guy. What about you?
Me neither. I do think Juwan Johnson should be the first guy off the board in fantasy drafts, and he is by a pretty wide margin. Juwan Johnson finished 17th last year in PPR points per game among tight ends, 13.7% target share. That was 21st at the position. He ranked 14th among 32 qualifying tight ends in yards per route run. So it was a pretty nice season, a fine season for a guy who, might still be on the ascent. He's been pretty buzzy this spring. I know him and Derek Carr have been, connecting quite often in these, early summer practices. We'll see, where that leads. But yeah, the Foster Moreau thing definitely adds risk to Johnson's profile. The Saints gave Moreau a 3-year, $12 million deal. So it wasn't like this, cheap 1-year flyer thing. It was a, pretty big investment for a guy who's, coming back from, what was it, lymphoma or whatever cancer diagnosis he had. So I do think Moreau is a potential problem for Juwan Johnson.
And the Saints were among the leaders in multiple tight end sets last year. So we should see both of these guys on the field, which I think is another reason to not be excited about Rashid Shaheed. Juwan Johnson is the receiver between the two. He spent a lot more time in the slot. So there is upside there. I just think that the playing time is going to remain limited. I don't think he's going to be a full-time player. He was about 65% last year. I think we're going to see something like that going forward. And he scored 7 touchdowns on 42 catches. I mean, that was a big part of his fantasy value. I'm going to go ahead and bet against him having a 17% touchdown rate year over year.
Yeah, good bet.
On to our final team for this one. It is the New York Giants. And another team, I think a lot of times, Jared, the reason that these teams are tough to project is that you look at the crew and it's a whole bunch of guys that you don't want to bet heavy on any of them. But we start with the wide receivers for most of these teams. I think you have to start at tight end with the Giants, and it's Darren Waller. And that's the Giant that I'm most interested in. What about you?
Yeah, the best bet to lead the Giants in targets this season. We haven't projected to lead the Giants in targets this season. Waller, coming off a disappointing 2022 season with the Raiders, he missed 8 games and really most of a 9th game with a hamstring injury last year. He was still tight end 7 in PPR points per game in his healthy games. Just a 15% target share for Waller last season, but go back to the previous 3 years, 22.4% target share, 26.3%, 23.3%. So he's shown the ability to, dominate a team's targets, especially, getting that type of share from a tight end is that's Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews type of territory. So he's shown the ability, Waller has, and with this Giants pass catching core, how weak and how many questions there are in it. Waller has a chance to see a 23-24% target share this season.
Yeah, because of the wide receivers that we'll get to in a minute around him that are lackluster. He's tight end 7 on Underdog. He's tight end 7 on FFPC. He is tight end 6 in our PPR and half PPR rankings. He is tight end 5 in projected points per game by our numbers. And I think that's important to look at because we haven't projected for 15 games. Now, the ceiling case, which you can see the ceiling projections on draftsharks.com or on your screen on YouTube right now, the ceiling case, here is based on that 15 game projection. I think ultimately if the ceiling certainly includes him playing every single game, I think ultimately the ceiling for Darren Waller, if everything goes right for him, if Daniel Jones plays well again, because he played better last year than we had seen previously, if the offense keeps picking up in year 2 under Brian Daboll, I think the ultimate ceiling is Darren Waller competing for one of the top spots among fantasy tight ends, top 2, top 3. Like even if Travis Kelce, I don't know, got injured, had a down season for whatever reason, Darren Waller, I think, is one of the guys who could challenge to lead the position overall if everything breaks right for him. So that to me, you look at our ranking versus his ADP, and you might think, okay, you guys like him a little bit more. The reason I would push that up a little bit is I think the upside is higher for him than the other guys around him in the rankings.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to put that 230 point ceiling in perspective, if he hit that number based on our projections, he'd be tight end 3. He'd be behind Travis Kelce, about a point per game behind Mark Andrews, then it'd be Darren Waller. So even if Kelce and Andrews have the seasons we expect them to have, I think Waller could be your tight end 3. So yeah, he's definitely a guy I've kind of warmed up to. I did think last year was a bit disappointing, but looking back on it, the hamstring injury, I think was the major reason for that. So I do think his upside is really as high as any tight end outside of Kelce and Andrews.
And the concern with him is that the injuries just stay a problem. It's been hamstring, it's been knee. That maybe that stuff's just going to factor in again. If he were going earlier, I might be less interested. But at tight end 7, that's a bet I'm making, especially when people are going to leave Hayden Hurst there for me as insurance later on. I can cover it. So the wide receivers should be easier to talk about because they stink right now. We'll see if anybody can prove that they don't stink in the season. But let's just look at the ADP on these Giants receivers. Jalen Hyatt, looking at underdog ADP, Jalen Hyatt, wide receiver 70 as the top Giants wide receiver. Wan'Dale Robinson, wide receiver 77. Isaiah Hodgins, 79. Darius Slayton, 86. Paris Campbell, 95. Sterling Shepard, 118. Now, Sterling Shepard, Jared, is not somebody I would draft in underdog where it's half PPR. But I think he's interesting for PPR going forward as a very end of the draft guy, because whenever Sterling Shepard's on the field, the Giants, and it's been over a couple of staffs now, a very small look last year, but still a different coaching staff, is like Sterling Shepard's a guy we want to have around, a guy we like in the locker room, a guy we like on the field, and is going to get some targets when he's on the field.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to count on him, and the Giants obviously aren't counting on him because they went out and added 2 slot receivers
every
this
slot
season
receiver
in Paris Campbell and Jameson Crowder after drafting Wan'Dale Robinson last year. So, I mean, to me, I'm surprised at those ADPs because our rankings have Isaiah Hodgins and Darius Slayton as the clear top 2 Giants receivers. I think those guys are, I'm not gonna say locked into the starting jobs, but they're the two bigger outside receivers, right? And I think Jalen Hyatt can play on the outside. I think he's kind of the guy who can go inside and outside. These other guys are all pure slot receivers. So I'm not excited about Hodgins or Slayton. They're wide receiver 61 and 63 in our half PPR rankings, but I do think they're pretty good bets to be close to full-time players this season. If you look at their 8 games together where they were both basically full-time players, 18.5% target share for Isaiah Hodgins, about 17.5% target share for Darius Slayton. So again, those are like wide receiver 4, maybe fantasy type target shares, which is I think is kind of the upside case for these guys. I don't think either of them have a chance to even be like top 30 wide receivers. But I do think if you have a Daniel Jones team and you're looking for a wide receiver to stack him with, I do think Hodges is my favorite, but then Slayton is right behind him.
Yeah, I agree with that on in a Daniel Jones lineup. And even if you don't have Daniel Jones, if you're just in that range and you're like, I don't like anything at wide receiver, take one of these Giants, because there's a path for any of these guys really to be the top scoring Giants wide receiver. And like I said, they're all going in a range where if you want to bet on whomever, if Jalen Hyatt's your favorite, go for it. If Wan'Dale Robinson's your favorite, go for it. Wan'Dale Robinson's the one that I'm most out on because he's coming off the ACL. He is a shorter range guy. He probably needs target volume more than these other players to actually pay off with anything. So I'm totally out on him for 2023. Hodgins has been my favorite because last year was our first look at him. He was buried in Buffalo and ultimately, dropped from that roster and picked up by the Giants, and then quickly worked into that lineup and was a big factor late in that season. His first, semi-season with the team, but he had been with Brian Daboll in Buffalo before. So he knew him, GM knew him, not a new player for them. Darius Slayton, we've seen be good, we've seen be bad. So if I'm choosing between those guys, I want to bet on the guy that we've seen more good from relative to the bad. But, again, with where they're going, bet on whomever you want late.
Yeah, and Jalen Hyatt, like I get the appeal because he's fast and he can be a big play guy. He seems like a guy who's going to kind of like take a red shirt this year. I think he has a long way to go. He dropped to the third round, which was a surprise when you had some mocks having him in round one. I just think he's more of a 2024 guy for the Giants.
Yeah, and maybe he's somebody that gets drafted in your league before you want to take him and then gets dropped by midseason. That might be somebody worth stashing. We'll talk more about that kind of strategy going forward, but that might be something to watch for. It's certainly worth keeping in mind that he was a round 3 pick, went after Tank Dell in that round. So this is going to be a situation where you're going to want to watch shark bites throughout the summer, because once we get to camp, we're going to be getting updates on these guys. We'll probably be evolving the rankings on them. We'll certainly be watching to see who is getting targets. For now, that's going to do it for this show. If you like what you've seen or heard here today, or any of the other shows, if you'll just like us in general, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel, give us a rating, give us a follow, whatever platform you're using, do the thing there for us. We appreciate it. And of course, check out the full rankings on draftsharks.com to see what we collectively think about all these players. Jared and I give our individual opinions on all of them while we're doing a show like this. But when it comes to the rankings, we get to a consensus. Not everybody's happy, but we get to one number that you get from the site, a clear projection of what we expect that guy to do, telling you where you want to draft him or not draft him, depending on the player. For Jared Smola and the entire Draft Sharks crew, I'm Matt Schauf saying thanks so much for swimming with us.